Hi, everyone. On behalf of Superintendent Mark Weekly, who supports and encourages us to do this type of programming, I'd like to welcome you to our trail talk today called York Equity, Race, and the Lewis and Clark Story with our special guest, Mr. Hasan Davis. Just wanted to let everybody know that today's session is going to be recorded, and we hope to have it available at a later date so you can rewatch it or share it with friends and family and colleagues. Because of the large volume of participants today, we're not going to be able to take verbal questions, but I do encourage you to interact and engage using the chat box with each other. And there's also a question function. So if you'd like to submit a question that for Hasan, or for me, of course, you can put that in the question. And then we're going to have two staff members kind of behind the scenes, and I'll ask them to jump in real quick. If Ashley and Katie will jump in, and there we go. There we go. So Katie Campbell is our visual information specialist, and Ashley Danielson is our partnership and volunteer specialist. And they're going to be helping and monitoring the chat box and the questions. So they'll try to, hopefully we can get to all of your questions. So thanks to both of them for kind of doing the behind the scenes work. So we'll please use that chat box, and you can have separate conversations on that too as we're having our conversation too. My name is Carla Sigala. I serve as the interpretive specialist for Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail, and I've been in this position since 2008. But I had a really unique opportunity to work with the trail during the bicentennial years for about a year and a half in 2003 and 2004. And that's where I was first introduced to Mr. Hasan Davis and the story of York, which I had personally never heard about. I had never learned about York in my studies. So it was a really eye-opening experience for me. But their bicentennial years were really interesting for me personally, but I think for the nation as a whole. Some of the things that the NPS leadership and tribal advisors pledged to and committed to in those early years of the bicentennial was, one, that they weren't going to celebrate the bicentennial, that they were going to commemorate it for many reasons. One being is that for many Americans, for Native peoples, it was the Lewis and Clark expedition was not something to celebrate. So commemorating that. The second thing that I think the bicentennial was really successful as is committing to opening up our eyes and our hearts to other perspectives and to communicate that to the public. And in the way that the Park Service sought out to do that is by having a traveling exhibit called Core of Discovery to 200 Years to the Future. And this traveling exhibit went from coast to coast and back during the bicentennial years. But a key feature in that exhibit was something called a Tent of Many Voices. And what this stage did was that provided a platform, an uncensored, unchecked platform for all peoples to be able to come and to tell their story as they knew it. So their own truth, their own stories, their oral histories, to present Native oral histories, traditions, culture, song and dance, and to really provide that platform to uplift those untold stories, which was, to me, a very successful thing that happened during the bicentennial years. I know Mr. Hasan Davis did a lot of talks and presentations of the Tent of Voices and has done ever since that time. The other thing that the bicentennial challenged us to do is that to kind of step off the boat that Lewis and Clark were traveling on, and to take a step back, step off the boats, get on the shore and look at the expedition from a different perspective and a different lens. So what did it look like if you were standing on the shore looking into the expedition? And we were challenged to do so, and asked to think about what is missing in the narrative of the Lewis and Clark story. And we have been committed to doing that. over the past years in the bicentennial, and I really honored and I have a pleasure of welcoming today Mr. Hasan Davis to our Trail Talk to discuss race, equity, York, and how it relates to the Lewis and Clark story. So I'm going to let Mr. Davis introduce himself today, and then we'll get started with the conversation. So welcome, Hasan.
Thank you, Carla. Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. It's just great to see so many familiar names and to be in this conversation, especially at this time. My name is Hasan Davis, and I've been involved with the trail and Lewis and Clark, I guess since 2000, around there, when I first began to develop and research the story of York. I'm an actor by training and a lawyer, which I guess means I'm an actor by training, being redundant. But my real focus has been for the last 25 years living history and historical interpretation. And I started with the story of a Civil War soldier, actually right here at Berea. I'm on Berea College's campus now, and Berea is known as, it was one of the first in the South interracial higher education institutions founded during slavery in a slave state. So very radical at the beginning. And the story was the story of a Civil War soldier who escaped slavery and served during the Civil War here in Kentucky, and then came to Berea to become his first African-American graduate. As I began to tell that story more widely than Kentucky, we were reaching the front edge of the 200th commemoration. And people began to say things like, Hasan, you should really, think of telling a story about Lewis and Clark, because, this is going to be this bicentennial, and I was like, I think I'm a pretty good actor, but I don't think that I can pull Lewis or Clark off. There's a lot of disbelief involved. And then someone said, no, there's this guy, York. And it was actually, I was probably performing in Missouri. I did a lot of national touring, but there was someone who I think was connected with the early conversations about the bicentennial. And so I became curious and really began to dig into the story of York. And at first, I'll be very honest, the story that was surfacing was that stereotypical step and fetch slave caricature that kind of supported the system that everybody liked to romanticize. The York that I was finding was the York of romance novels, where you have your two brave heroes, Lewis and Clark, but they're out there in the wild and they can't do all the great stuff that you do in romance novels. And so you had this guy, York, who became the perfect fall guy for that. He could be lascivious, he could be all those things that they wanted to get to, but your pristine heroes didn't have to carry that weight. And so a lot of the stuff I found about him were very ugly, the bull stud of the steppes kind of. And I was like, there's no way I'm telling this story. Luckily, I didn't just get disgusted and walk away. I went to St. Louis, got into their archives, and began to dig around. And then I also got the journals and began to look around. And as I started to piece together those first person accounts, the people that were with York, that York was with on a daily basis, through all that, a narrative began to shape that was much more powerful. And when I realized that over close to 1 million words of text associated with those journals, and not one of these men who were all raised in a society that told them that but for an accident of their birth they had no control over, they had absolute power over another people just because of that thing, not because of their brilliance or because they've invented something amazing or because they were courageous, but just because their skin was white. And 1 million words of text, and none of these people who were completely indoctrinated into the system that told them of their absolute power, not one of them had a negative word to say. They didn't talk about him being lazy or being stupid or being shiftless or being, sneaky, all those stereotypes and caricatures that underpin the system. And this was in real time, right? This wasn't looking back 100 years going, revisionist. This was in real time. And those men didn't have those words, couldn't find those words to describe his participation and his contribution. That, more than anything, made me courageous enough to step into the story and figure out where I could lead it. And around that same time, I met a man named Jim Holmberg, He's a historian of the Clark family at the Filson Society in Louisville. And I'd worked with him on a couple of other things, but he worked with me as I was developing my one-man show, my interpretation. But he had all of these handwritten letters from William Clark to his brother Jonathan that had never seen the light of day. They were, this collection that he was editing that now is the collection called Dear Brother. But he started to copy these and give them to me. And the story of York through Clark's eyes, that all that energy after the expedition that we never knew anything about, made it imperative. I knew that I had to tell this story because there was so much new information to inform the story of us that when we thought we knew, but has so much more complexity and detail now that we know the rest of the story. And that really became the thing that fired me up. So as we reached, into the bicentennial, I was lucky enough to meet some folks from the national parks as they were making plans and along the trail, and they saw enough value in the work that I was doing to make me a steady part of that conversation. The Ten of Many Voices holds a lot of amazing memories for me. One of my friends, one of the rangers that was there quite a while, finally told me once that they had a protocol called the Hasan Davis York Protocol, where when there was Hasan Davis night in the tent, they had to pull out all the extra chairs from the truck and build out into the outside the tent area. And I felt really good that it was so well attended and so well supported by folk across the trail who wanted to hear and add this story to the story we already know, because it gives us so much more to talk about when we talk about not just where we were, but how that informs where we are now and how we move forward.
Thank you. That's a great story. I didn't know that story, that they pulled every chair out for you. That's wonderful. So you probably were wondering, like, why is the National Park Service and the trail having this conversation? And my answer is, what better place to do so? The Park Service and the trail is charged with protecting and the sharing of American history, and Black history is American history. American Indian Native history is American history. And by extension, I think all of the Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail partners, sites that tell the Lewis and Clark story and protect sites related to it, probably are wanting to do that, and they have that in their best interest to do that. But as you can see, 2004, the bicentennial, or even 2000 when you started at Hasan, this is not a new conversation. We've been having it for a few years, but the thing is that we need to keep having it over and over and over again. And we were just recently reminded by this, by the egregious killing of Breonna Taylor, of George Floyd, of Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others that have given their lives, been killed. And we need to continue to have this conversation because it is part of our messy American history. And I'm so glad that you're here to kind of guide us in that conversation, because this has become a national conversation. I think everybody is talking about it. It's all in our minds. We're all dealing with it in a different way, personally, professionally. So I think having these conversations are going to be really important going forward. And that one that we need to continue to engage with. We need to learn from it. We need to learn to listen a lot, and just kind of commit to doing better, and doing better at telling these amazing stories, because they are part of our heritage and are part of our history. We pledged a long time to do this, a long time ago, to do this type of work. But as we get farther away from the bicentennial, we run the risk of becoming complacent. We run the risk of losing track, or getting distracted, or getting a little bit lazy about it. But now is not the time to do that. And so we hope that this conversation is just a continuation of those early days and what we have been doing over the past few years to kind of continue this. And we hope to have more conversation like this to reach broader audiences. And also, I think we have a lot to learn about how we tell these stories in our sites, in our museums, in our visitor centers, how we talk and engage the public with it. So we're so happy to that you're here with us, and we hope to continue this conversation. and bring others to the table too.
Yeah, and I'm glad to be here. You know, one of the things you mentioned, I think there was an urgency during the bicentennial. I think that's what we saw when when Coda had so much control over making sure that this was a commemoration and that they were involving all the indigenous communities along the trail in really meaningful ways, so that their story could be told, not the story, but their story. And I think
And
that
CODA is Circle of Tribal Advisors.
Thank you. Yeah, yeah, and one of the things that really amazed me about the bicentennial and made me want to be such an integral part of it and be so connected to it was I saw the intentionality on so many levels to make sure that this wasn't a set story, that this wasn't just a retelling of the story we've been telling for 200 years, but to allow those new voices and new perspectives to not just be present, but to be powerful. And truthfully, those experiences informed my telling of York's story in so many amazing ways, as I was gifted with stories from elders from the Nez Perce, or storytellers from the Missouri Oto, who pulled me aside and said, no, let me tell you how we know York. So because you need to understand as you embody him, that there is so much more. And so those were the amazing gifts. And I think the conversations that were started there now take this urgency on when we do get back to how do we make these spaces not just safe for every American to encounter, but relevant to every American as they encounter them. And I think that's what that's the work that has been done so well. And I think that's the work that needs to be done now to keep the conversation alive.
Sonia, you're going to tell us a little bit about, oh, sorry, Katie, go ahead.
Katie?
Oh, you might be muted.
All right. Well, we've already been getting some great questions from the audience. So I know when you both transitioned into talking about York in the expedition, two questions to keep in mind. One from Marianne Albee. She says, what did Lewis and Clark expect York's role to be? Was he hired for his expertise in any area? What did York perceive his role to be? How was he treated by other members in the expedition? And a question from Stephanie Wood just says, thank you so much, Mr. Davis. Wish I could have heard your presentation in the tent of many voices. Could you tell us a story or two about York in the Corps?
Great. So Carla, I can kind of step into those a little bit if we want to. So speaking of York before the expedition, I think that the image or the frame that I've built as I've created the story and done the research is that York was by all accounts loyal, right? And some of these are going to be things that are not a surprise. If York was as big as the accounts of him say he was, he would have been prime material for a back-breaking labor as a as a course. But his presence, his father being present, old York, who everyone says was probably served the same role for William Clark's father in his younger days. And so York was connected to Clark from very early in his life. And what that looks like, I think, as a child, from things that I've read, other accounts of these experiences of hand servants or, we call them lots of colloquial names for, personal valet slaves, was that he would have been acculturated with Clark so much so that he would be able to be in alignment with him as far as how they feel and how they experience the world, right? A real sense that there was a duty to him, and maybe even as children, being put into a position to believe that there was a friendship, a relationship there beyond a master-slave relationship. And I think that as they grew up, that would have been a very powerful part of what made York useful to Clark, knowing that he always had, someone with him who was going to be his protector, his provider, his support system. If all things in the world failed him, I believe Clark could have believed and imagined that York was going to be the most constant thing in his life. And you know, the the terms I'm using, thing and slave, I want to be really clear. I'm using those terms because this was absolutely a chattel system. No matter how well you dress up, and people like to talk about the camaraderie, no matter how well you dress that up, in a system where one person is automatically given control and power over another for nothing but the color of their skin. That, there the absolute belief in a relationship, a friendship, is hard to imagine. One, because power dynamics don't allow that. It may look a lot like friendship on a daily basis, but there's still someone who gets to decide when the other goes home or goes to the bathroom or falls in love or gets married or decides that they want to do something else in their life. And so I think it's really important, as we have conversation about enslavement, that we're really clear this is a power system, not a relationship system. But in that power system, I believe York could have easily understood, looking around him, that he ate better, he lived safer, and he lived in more luxury than probably most of the people in the Americas, not just most Black people. I mean, he was in a family representing a family of entitlement. And so many of those things would have been, and that's the argument I hear, every once in a while you get in this debate, well, York had a great life. Why would he be upset? He should be happy that he had somebody feed him. And again, go back, this is about the power dynamic, not about the thing you see on, in one day at a time, but the scope of his experience. So in that vein, I think that his experience enslaved to William Clark was an experience that he was loyal to. I think that he came on the expedition not because he had any particular skill, but because he had many of the skills that they looked for. I mean, when they had their list of the qualities they needed, he would have been able to check all of those off. He was a trained frontierman because he grew up in a family that was on the frontier. He understood how to navigate the rivers because that was a thing that they did. Clark talks about him in his own letters about him sailing the boat up the river and doing his work. So he was important to Clark because he was the holder of Clark's memory and work on a daily basis. But at the same time that they wanted these aspects from the people, the volunteers, they also said they didn't want them to be married or have family attachment because everybody might die and they didn't want to leave families without a man to take care of the family. But we know that York was actually married. And so that's when it kind of starts to break apart this whole idea that he was seen like the others, because he wasn't. He was seen as something useful to William Clark. And when he started, I think that his role, as you look at the first entries in the journals, his role is there supporting the captains and taking care of them. When they get to Camp Dubois at St. Louis, you can start to see some shifts as the crew begin to get used to him being there. And sometimes it seems speaking for William Clark, and and them having to listen to him tell him what to do because he speaks for Clark. But I think that William Clark's biggest reason for taking him was realizing that on the expedition into the unknown, there are a lot of things that you can't account for. And if something went wrong and there was a mutiny, he wanted to have the biggest, strongest guy behind him without any question that he would be there to back him up. And I think that's what he believed. Now, as they entered into the expedition beyond St. Louis and they started to meet the amazing people across the frontier, these communities, he started to see himself, I think, differently because they saw him differently, as they gave him names like Black Indian or Big Medicine, as the Missouri Oto sub chief who greeted him came right up to York and began to talk to him like he was a friend, and they had to explain to him that he was just the guy with the guy, but the sub chief was a member of the Bear Clan, and he thought that York was the living representation, embodiment of the Bear spirit, his spirit, and he was so concerned that his spirit didn't recognize him. This is a story that came to me from the Missouri Oto storyteller. He was so concerned that his own spirit couldn't recognize him that once they began to have the council on the bluff, he excused himself and went off to fast and meditate to figure out what he had done wrong to offend his spirit so much that they couldn't recognize him. So these kind of stories become the things that York encounters, people looking at him and saying, wow, you're amazing. Did God send you here? And so I think that as that became apparent, William Clark, probably quicker than Meriwether Lewis, recognized the value of him as another icebreaker. He would get York to do feats of strength and to dance on his hands and to impress people, and then he could come back with the sales pitch. Yeah, he's amazing. He's so powerful, and I own everything about him. And if he's so powerful, imagine what I must be if I can control everything about him. So you really need to listen. So he became a very useful tool, I think, unknown to Clark when they started, but very quickly recognized when they began to encounter tribes and communities that were less accepting of the idea that somebody else was coming to take their stuff just because they thought they had a right to it. He was a buffer in so many ways. And so I think his presence, and it's clear he knew how to fight. He knew how to fire a rifle. He had his own rifle, which was unheard of very often for enslaved people. He was trusted not just to secure and support things, but to be a part of, forward parties and hunting parties and conversations. So he was a full force member. I don't think he started as that. I think Clark started with him as his creature comfort, the thing that he was most familiar with, but then realized that so much of that, once they got out of the trappings of civilization, that he was so much more. I'm gonna take a deep breath. I'm sorry, I get excited.
Hi, we have a submitted question. Somebody asked, did York ever overdo his magical powers perceived by the Native Americans and perhaps be restrained by fellow Corps members?
Wow. That's an interesting question. I don't know that I have an answer for that. I think that I have not found any places where he was limited in his connection and his representation to the folks that they met, where he was reprimanded. In fact, there were a number of people who were reprimanded or punished, and he was never one of those folks. And so I don't know. I've not seen that, and I've not experienced that as part of the story that I hear or that I've researched. But it would be interesting to know if there was a sense that folks thought that was part of the story. I'd be glad to look deeper into it. But I don't think that he. Well, I guess there is a point where one of the stories talks about someone coming to do what they did very often. They did the rub test to make sure that he wasn't just a white guy painted black. And there was one account where it said that he kind of didn't appreciate that anymore, and maybe gave a look or put his hand on his dagger, like that wasn't something that he was willing to continue to be that guy. And I would imagine that's probably around the same time that he realized that he was being used as part of the sales pitch, that he had become, one of the pieces showing those folk that they were meeting, that they had new bosses and new ownership, and so it seems like maybe he finally got tired of being tokenized like that and realized that it wasn't really to his benefit that was happening. It was to somebody else's benefit. And again, it put him right back into the narrative of being the property and the puppet of someone else.
Thanks, Hasan. So we have a couple more questions in regards to the enslavement of York. This one asks, since William Clark's father owned York's father, how did York come to be exclusively William Clark's enslaved person? William being only one of the father's several children.
That's a great question. And I've not been able to find a reason for that. I would imagine William being the youngest probably curried some favor, and most of the others, my guess is they probably, well, I know that George Rogers Clark and the other brothers had their own enslaved population. They had their own property, and it could just be that this was, York was going to be William's, first, slave, his gift as a young man, his companion. And I think that it's clear from the historians and the folks that studied this that York was meant to be his companion. So maybe William's father just made that decision, and he happened to be the right age at the right time for that to be the connection that he made.
Hassan, a lot of times in telling the Lewis and Clark story, people talk a lot about the vote when they got to the Pacific Ocean, right? And a lot of emphasis is put on both Sacagawea and and York were able to vote as to what side of the river they were going to make their winter camp.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about your perspective on that vote?
Sure. So I'm of two heads with it, right? I think that it was actually a pretty amazing thing, and at the same time, I think that it was just a thing. I think that when they reached the Pacific, the mouth of the Columbia, and William Clark, who seems to be the one who really puts forth the idea of everyone deciding, I think it was strategic, and I think it was leadership. You know, all counts, we talk about Clark being, you know, gregarious and outgoing, a people person. That's why Lewis wanted him there. Lewis didn't want to be the sole leader because he had no people skills. He was really smart. He knew science stuff, but you know, I'm pretty sure that expedition wouldn't have made it to St. Louis with him alone. And Clark, I think, was just the opposite. He could build that sense of camaraderie, esprit de corps. And so I believe as they got to that point where they were haggard and they were drenched and they were soaked to the bone and everyone miserable, he realized that he had to give his team something to pull them back together. And telling, you know, not just telling a black enslaved man that he has the right to, not just telling an indigenous woman who had been stolen, enslaved, married off, that she had a voice, but all of these French and native boatmen, all of these enlisted men, you know, all of these poor men. So poor men voting with the aristocracy didn't happen. Enlisted men voting with the officers didn't happen. And so all of these things were a unique, so him putting that out there, I think gave everybody a boost in a sense that this was something unique. They were doing something that had never been done. And so I think part of it was strategic, just to get that energy back in them and make them ready to stay in the fight with him. But at the same time, I do think he recognized that without this diverse group of folks, there's no way they could have survived. And so having a chance to reward them with some voice in it, I think was a great leadership act. I mean, if you think about it, it would, everybody votes, they decide which side to settle, they work hard to get camps set. It would be another 60 years before the legal end of enslavement. You know, some would argue another 100 years before it was safe for African descendants to vote. It'd be another 100 years before the women's suffrage movement gathered enough steam for women to voice their thoughts and to vote. It'd be 120 years before indigenous native people were considered American citizens. But right there at the edge of the world, it's like they tore that first section out of the Declaration of Independence and says, yeah, this right here is what we're going to do. And so they lived it out in some amazing way that was the exemplifying of all these ideas we've been struggling for ever since. And then they got back to civilization and they did what we do during every amazing pivotal event in our history up to this point. They looked around and said, well, let's not talk about that. That's probably not what makes us amazing. We see it in the Revolution. We see it in the War of 1812, where Andrew Jackson gets up and speaks with fire about the black soldiers that served and helped him preserve, you know, this new nation, and then turns around and enacts all of this ugly, right, and continues this system of slave entitlement. We see it in Civil War. So every time we get into these pinches where all hands on deck, you know, pivotal, fighting fascism and all these other things, we have this power to come together and everybody stands tall and steps forward, sometimes in spite of their best interest. And right after that, historically, we've had this moment where people go, yeah, we did do some amazing, but you know, that's not who we are. That's just our emergency selves. And I think that maybe part of the lesson is maybe we can make this our normal operating system. that we do our best together, right? That whole idea of a pluribus unum, out of many one, could be the thing that really moves us forward instead of just that emergency thing that we pull up whenever the whole world goes wild around us. But I think that vote was powerful because it did say something, even there at the edge of the world, and it proved as a proof of concept this idea of the Declaration. But I think that our leaders there were too afraid to lose their station, their power, and their authority. It was the same thing that happened with Jefferson and lots of others who talked and understood what they were doing was wrong, but they still could not afford or had to imagine losing the power that came with that wrongness, and would rather ask for forgiveness at the end than to do the right thing at the beginning. And so for me, that was the lesson of it.
We have a submitted question. It says, I'm a ranger at Lewis and Clark National Historical Park. That's in Oregon, in Washington State. I'm interested in using York's story to invite visitors to examine the impact of racism on both our history that has transpired and how it is presented in retrospect. In what ways, if any, have you found it most effective to engage visitors in this conversation?
Ooh, that's a great question. I think using York as a template, as a frame for a conversation is a pretty powerful place to start. But I think it has to be York on the continuum. I think you have to tell the story of York's return and Clark's refusal to set him free. I mean, it's important to, one, talk about York's contributions and to highlight all those places in the journals where they specifically say, wow, York was doing, was gangbusters. York was present. York was active. York, was the one comforting Sergeant Floyd and helping him, through his transition. And talk about those things because they really do set that he was not just present, but he was actively present. And then you can have the conversation at the end about, even with those contributions, even with the courage to stay involved in a process that did not benefit him, the idea of there being something different on the way back, coming back into the civilized world, quote unquote, seemed to be really real for him. But when he got back and began to ask William Clark for his freedom, asked William Clark if he would help him purchase his wife from this other slave, holder, so that his family could be safe and together, asked him to let him stay in Louisville instead of moving to St. Louis when Clark moves to St. Louis because his family's there and he wants to find a way to protect them. And so, in William Clark's letters to his brother, which are all in Jim Holmberg's edited book, Dear Brother, it is such a powerful, painful place to see and realize that Clark's perception of York didn't change, right? Everything about York changed on those 3-year plus years out there. Nothing about Clark changed. That was just an adventure. And when he came back, he went right back to an amazing life and thought the rest of the world would snap back with him. But my mama says sometimes you can't unboil an egg. And I think that once York experienced all of that, he realized that his value, wasn't attached to his skin, but to his courage, his capacity, and his willingness to engage like other men and women in accomplishing something. And so his expectations changed. So I think it's a great conversation to have with folks when we can look at the whole range of it, and then we can see the injustice and recognize, that, and this is just one story of millions where people work hard their entire life for no benefit, right? I mean, even just breaking down the idea, when I work with younger students, just breaking down the idea of what slavery is. I say it's your mom and dad working 7 days a week with no weekends off, no vacation days, no sick days. They don't get insurance, they don't get 401k retirement. All they get to do is do what somebody else tells them, and the other person gets paid all the money for it. And I've not had a young person yet. So that sounds like a great system. I want that. And so when we can break it down into its component pieces, what the system was, and then ask people, what do you think about someone working their entire life to benefit another person with no benefit to themselves? And now there's got to be careful because there'll be I had an audience member doing Q&A once tell me, you make it sound like there were no good slave masters. And I had to take a deep breath and pause, because I've learned that as a lawyer, you kind of wait to see what's coming. And her next sentence, she was an older woman, was my granddaddy was a beautiful master. He loved his slaves, and he gave them most Sundays off. And he hardly ever beat them, and he made sure that they had plenty of food, And so again, there's this trap that we can get into when we think about conditions of individuals. One, I stopped and said, "Man, well, I appreciate you being proud of your ancestors. But I have never been able to put the words great and slave master in the same sentence, because they seem antithetical, right? The audacity to own another person's soul seems to eliminate the ability for great to be part of the conversation. Better than some, okay. And so I think that when you get, this conversation has those kind of nuances, when we start to really think about what people's, not just their lived experience, but their historical understanding of it, especially if they have connections to it. If they have history with enslavement in their family, right? There's guilt, there's embarrassment, there's shame, and there's a sense that we have to try and find a way to make this okay. And sometimes you just have to say, there's not a way to. One of my favorite memories of the bicentennial was sitting down with Bud Clark, William Clark's great descendant. And after one of my programs, and asking him, "Bud, you've seen this a few times, but I have to know, how does this hit you?" Right? When I start to talk about William Clark, and it's not the William, it's not the story that everybody has heard for 200 years. And he said, "Hasan, it hurts, but I never walk away, and I never stop listening, because it is the truth. And if I can't own the truth of who he was in those darker parts, then there's nothing about the great things that he's remembered for that mean anything." And it's like any of us, right? All of us have the ability to succumb to the pressure of our times, even when we know right from wrong. Because people do this whole thing, well, it was a different time, so they had different morals. The Bible hasn't been rewritten in ever. Let's just be really clear. And so when I think about that, and I think about the ideas of what it, these are not new ideas. That's why there were abolitionists. That's why there were folks who really pushed this from the beginning, because they knew morally, especially in a new land where we're talking about the enlightenment of man, right? This whole John Locke idea, that was the whole focus of this new nation, to be free, and only tethered by the word of God, no other man. And they immediately turned that whole system back on itself in order to have control, so that they could generate wealth, so that then they could be independent, right? And so it takes you down a slope, but just the idea that there were people who benefited from this, and we have to be able to talk about that in real time, own it, and then say, "I'm going to do something about it." We don't have to debate it. We don't have to argue it. It is a fact, and it happened. The question is, who are we, and how are we going to ensure that it never happens again, that it becomes our history, not just our next story? Don't get me all fired up here.
Yeah, Hasan, I want to take advantage of the fact that we're really digging into the deepest parts of what we're here to discuss, and ask you two questions from our chat. The first is, and you've been speaking to this already, how do you show the wrongness of slavery without stirring up unhealthy unrest? And the second is, I'm curious to hear your perspective on representing York in a story using displays such as statues and mannequins.
Okay. So how do we tell the story without, so I don't know that I've ever started telling the story wanting to avoid stirring up wrongness, because I think that these stories have made us so comfortable for centuries that it's very hard to convince folk that it really is the wrong story, unless you really get to the visceral parts of it. When I first started researching and developing my interpretation of York, I had a professional panel, humanities scholars and folks, who asked me if I could make it more happy. You know, he sounded so angry sometimes, and maybe it would be better received if, you know, and I'll be honest, you know, in my interpretation, you will laugh, you will cry, you'll sigh. I mean, it's all in there, but it's all in there serving York and his storytelling, not serving to make somebody comfortable with his story. And I've had people, you know, literally stand up and walk away because they couldn't hear the story that they had romanticized so long, their entire lives, being told with a different ending, with a different voice. And part of it, I had to just accept that that's part of the growth, right? I think that we tell stories as openly and as honestly as we can, and we invite people to come in where they are. You don't have to come in, you know, believe, but to come in willing to listen and have conversation about it, right? Come with questions. The questions are the thing that allow, you know, that I've enjoyed most about this in the last 20 years. The questions that come after I do a 45 or 50-minute interpretation, because people are open emotionally and mentally, because they are invested in a person who is going through a specific experience, and it has given some of the most amazing opportunities. And you know, and so I don't think that, I think that we have to tell stories and invite people to bring their courageous selves to the stories and be willing to listen without blame. One, because the story of York and most of the stories we tell are not stories or experiences that were perpetuated by anyone living today. I mean, we have guilt and we have ownership because of our ancestral ties, but those are so paralyzing. And so a big piece of it is asking people to divest of their guilt, divest of their desire to respond, right, from the emotion that they're feeling in the moment, and to just listen. And after you listen, figure out what the questions are that you like to ask that would help us interrogate the circumstances and really get to answers. But I think this is the place where we need courageous conversation, and people who are willing to step into them. You know, I've been confronted by, you know, sons of the Confederacy, you know, and who said, you know, well, you're going to be talking, you're just going to be downing, you know, white people in the Confederate. So this is when I do my Civil War. So, and it's the same conversation. You know, I'm not here to attack you. I'm here to tell a story and to have a conversation with you after that. I hope both of us will walk away with. I'll tell a quick. We were in Kamiah with the Ten of Many Voices, and I was there for a week. It was an amazing time. But one of my nightly performances, the next morning, Kamiah is like a city block square, maybe two. But I was at the little diner downtown, and a couple comes in. And the woman is what we call out here in Kentucky. She was dressed holiness, you know, long denim skirt, a plain shirt, no makeup, long hair. She paused at my table and she said, "Thank you so much for the program last night. It was very enlightening." And she moved on. So, you know, thank you. And then this big shadow kind of looms over my table. And I look up and it's her husband. And he's like this big mountain man. He's like 6'6", you know, I mean, he's like big guy. And so he just kind of stands there for a second. So I stood up. Wasn't quite sure where it was going, just, you know, and he reached out and he grabbed my hand and he starts to tear up. And he says, "I have needed to hear that story my entire life. And I want to just thank you for being brave enough to come here and tell me that story." And we just kind of stood there, you know, him tearing up and holding hands, and you know, these two big guys holding hands in the middle of Kamiah, Idaho diner. And we kind of, you know, got ourselves together real quick, and he just kind of nodded again, and he quietly walked off. But that was the thing, right? If I had taken that story and tried to shape it so that people wouldn't be forced to listen and hear their own stories and experience, then he wouldn't have had that moment. I don't know what it did to him long term. But I know in that moment, we were connected in a way that he and I would have never imagined, looking at each other across the room. But when we create space for these kind of conversations and invite folks to bring themselves in with nothing attached to it, right? No blame, no guilt. Nobody alive started this thing. but it's our responsibility to make sure that we know enough about it that it doesn't continue. And I think that's the power that we have. Now, I totally lost the second. Oh, representation of York in presentation. I have seen some statues of York, mannequins of York that were really good, and I've seen some that have made me cringe. I think that if you were going to find visual representation for York, I think it's important to consult people. And I know across the park you have people of color who ought to be, if they're not in positions to speak to those types of things, to talk about context, archaeologists and anthropologists and folks that can to give a sense of what's good and what's not. I think that too often and very easily it can slip into caricature and into supporting the narrative that has been so powerful throughout our history. And so the biggest thing I say is go into it with intention. And the investigative work that you have to do is so much more. And not just for York, I think that if you are going to represent any persons or groups of persons that aren't traditionally represented or historically represented, right? And we know that all of these historical places we safeguard have touched and been touched by people of color from a wide range, but they're not always the ones represented. And so I think in that representation, having the ability to really bring people in to test, right, to test your perception and thinking of what is acceptable and appropriate, so that you really do come up with the very best. And it may be you still make somebody mad. That will happen. Y'all know that. I mean, I've been out, y'all know somebody's still not going to be happy. It's the idea of being intentional and really thinking about it, so that at least you can go to those folks who want to say, these are the steps we took to get to this point, and we thought it was enough. If you think there's something else we can do, maybe you can contribute. And our next iteration might be different. But this is where we are with our very best thinking, with folks that we believe had our best interest in mind.
Well, this has been the fastest 55 minutes I think that I've ever.
Like 30 more minutes. Uh-oh. Gosh.
Well, I think we have time for maybe one other question. Let me see, it's coming through the chat box here. Do you have any specific suggestions to us here on the Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail on how we can use our role and the role of the Lewis and Clark Trail to make this history relevant to the efforts to address hate, injustice, and racism today? And I think to add to that by extension, the Lewis and Clark Trail community in general, I think there's visitor centers, museums who want to do this work too. So how can we as a Lewis and Clark Trail community do that?
That's a great question. I think that the thing that comes to mind first is being willing to tell other stories. And I think that just, and it takes research, it takes really digging in, telling the stories from a different perspective, right? There are lots of folks at any one of these points along the trail who were inexperienced. You know, there's a perspective of Lewis and Clark in their journals where they wrote the things that were pertinent to them and important to their telling of the story. But there are also indigenous Native communities that they encountered who have different stories that can be told. There are also people like York, Sakakawea, Charbonneau. I mean, yeah, Charbonneau, you know, he gets a rep, but you know, he's got a story in there somewhere too, right? Drew Yard. And so I think what this unique ragtag band of explorers provides, because they were so different than so many other, right? I mean, the standard pattern for an exploratory unit was to be, you know, the descendant of some great man who was never going to reach authority and power, because you got 4 other brothers ahead of you, so you got to go out and do something to make a name, and it's usually an expedition. and they usually got all their buddies who were the fourth kid of somebody powerful who were never going to be anything, and they got together. They were going to go and open up something. Most of them never showed up again because, you know, they were homogenous groups with the same language skills, the same skills for dealing with problems, and the same way of reacting to the world out of their authority and power. But Lewis and Clark pulled together this group of people that were frontier men, enlisted soldiers, African descendant, native born. This eclectic group became capable of addressing any problem they faced. I mean, that's why when they were having these hostilities with members of the Sioux, you know, a woman from the, you know, the Omaha Nation who had married in could go to Crozat and said, hey, they like your horses more than they like you. You should probably find a reason not to sleep here tonight, or everybody's going to be dead, you know. And so having this diversity was the thing that kept them alive. Our ability along the trails to speak to that diversity and to be intentional about it. Not just speak it when there's a school bus of young people of color who came in from the big city to do an afternoon, but it has to be the conversation embedded in all the things that we talk about, because they were there the whole time, not just when a busload of kids showed up. And so our ability to tell that story consistently and our interpretation consistently to everybody who encounters it makes a change in the perception of those folk who come to the story that they should expect. It should be the story of us, not the story of me. And I think that we have a lot of power there because we have the stories. We just have to give ourselves authorization and give our folk permission to tell all of those stories. And it can still be interpreted from some of the voices and experiences of folk who are always there. There are places and spaces for other folk to be in those stories. And I think that's the piece that's important, to be intentional and diligent about opening up the conversation and inserting those voices and those faces so that the rest of the world sees as they come in. When we say us, when we say all, this is what us and all means to the national parks.
I think that's just a perfect and beautiful way to end this conversation. We can't thank you enough, Hasan, for joining us for this 1 hour of conversation.
I love y'all. This is y'all feed me. This is my heart stuff. Thank you. I'm sorry. I'm still excited. Sorry, Carla.
No. Thank you. It's so powerful. We are very thankful to have you and for you to be available to join us today. And if I'm like if anybody else on the call is like me, I could do this all day. We could talk about this all day. We would need more water to stay hydrated. But I'd like to thank everybody who joined us on this call today. We will make this recording available and we'll send that out shortly. So thank you so much. If you didn't get your question addressed today, we might have those recorded, or you can email them in and maybe we can address those at a later time.
Great, I'd love to.
Thank you, everybody, and have a good weekend.
Thanks, you all. Stay safe.